It was the mistake that should have destroyed his farm forever. When Arthur Pendleton stumbled through his barn at 2 in the morning, blinded by exhaustion and suffocating debt, he didn't just mix the wrong chemicals, he triggered a biological anomaly. What sprouted from the dead, cracked earth of Oak Haven County didn't just save his family's legacy. It humiliated the brightest agricultural scientists in the country, sparked a corporate sabotage war, and changed modern farming overnight. Here is how a desperate accident broke every rule in the book. The soil of Oak Haven, Nebraska didn't just look dead, it sounded dead. When Arthur Pendleton walked across his lower 40 acres, the earth crunched beneath his boots like crushed bone. It was late July, and a brutal, unyielding drought had baked the moisture out of the ground, leaving behind a sprawling network of deep, thirsty fissures. Arthur knelt, scooping up a handful of the dirt. It slipped through his calloused, grease-stained fingers like dry ash. The hot wind immediately caught it, carrying the remnants of his family's legacy away into the hazy, unforgiving sky. For 3 generations, the Pendleton farm had yielded some of the finest corn in the county. Now, it was a burial ground for withered, yellowing stalks that barely reached a man's knee. He stood up, wiping his brow with the back of a forearm deeply tanned and lined by years of punishing labor. At 42, Arthur looked a decade older. The relentless stress of the past 3 years had carved deep trenches into his face and dusted his dark hair with premature silver. When he returned to the farmhouse, the porch boards groaned under his weight. Inside, the kitchen was stifling, the air heavy with the smell of stale coffee and impending ruin. His wife, Claire, sat at the worn oak table. Spread out before her was a fan of envelopes, their return addresses practically screaming off the paper: Midland National Bank, Oak Haven Ag Supply, State Department of Revenue. Claire looked up, her eyes rimmed with red. She didn't have to speak. The crisp, official-looking letter resting on top of the pile told Arthur everything he needed to know. "Notice of intent to foreclose," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. "David Henley called this morning. He said the bank can't grant us another extension, Arthur. The grace period is over. We have exactly 30 days to clear the delinquency, or they seize the land." Arthur walked to the sink, turning on the tap. A brief, rusty sputter of water emerged before running clear. He splashed it on his face, letting the cool liquid shock his system. "Henley is just a mouthpiece," Arthur muttered, gripping the edge of the counter until his knuckles turned white. "It's not the bank making the call, it's Croft." As if summoned by the sheer resentment in the room, the crunch of heavy tires on gravel echoed through the open kitchen window. Arthur looked out to see a pristine, midnight blue Range Rover pulling into their driveway, kicking up a cloud of the very dust that was choking Arthur's livelihood. Out stepped Harrison Croft. Impeccably dressed in a tailored vest and a crisp white shirt rolled neatly at the forearms, Croft looked utterly alien against the backdrop of the dying farm. He was the CEO of Croft AgriCorp, a sprawling, heavily subsidized corporate farming conglomerate that had been systematically devouring independent family farms across the Midwest. By his side was Dr. Elias Whitmore, Croft's chief agronomist. Whitmore was a man who looked like he had never touched dirt without wearing sterile latex gloves. He held a sleek tablet, his eyes scanning the Pendleton property with clinical disdain. Arthur stepped out onto the porch, letting the screen door slam shut behind him. "Arthur," Croft called out, plastering on a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I know it's a bad time. Believe me, I take no pleasure in seeing a neighbor struggle. You're 20 miles away, Harrison." "That barely makes us neighbors," Arthur replied, staying on the porch. "And you take plenty of pleasure in it. What do you want?" Croft sighed, feigning a look of deep sympathy. "I spoke with David Henley at the bank. I know about the notice, Arthur. The foreclosure is imminent. Your crops are dead. The soil tests Elias ran on the perimeter show your nitrogen levels are essentially non-existent, and the pH is completely toxic. It's over." Dr. Whitmore tapped his tablet, adjusting his silver-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Pendleton, The topsoil degradation on your property has passed the point of economic viability. Even with our proprietary, high-yield synthetic fertilizers, it would take a massive capital injection over 5 years just to stabilize the microbiology. You simply don't have the chemistry or the capital. I didn't ask for a consultation, Elias, Arthur snapped. Croft stepped closer, placing a hand on the porch railing. I am offering you a way out, Arthur, a dignified exit. Croft Agricorp will buy the land. We will pay off your debt to Midland National, and we'll cut you a check for $50,000. It's enough for you and Claire to move to the city, get a fresh start. If you let the bank take it, you walk away with absolutely nothing. In fact, you'll still owe them for the equipment. Arthur looked at Croft's manicured hand, resting on the weathered wood of his grandfather's porch. 50,000 for 400 acres. You're offering me pennies on the dollar because you know the bank is holding a gun to my head. I'm offering you a life raft while you're drowning. Croft's polite facade slipped, revealing the cold, calculating corporate predator underneath. Look around you. Your father Thomas drove this farm into the ground with his ridiculous, old-world organic experiments. And you finished the job. The land is dead, Arthur. Sell it to me, or the bank takes it on the first of the month. Arthur's jaw tightened. He stepped down to the first stair, towering over Croft. Get off my land, Harrison. If I'm going down, I'll go down fighting. I'm not selling my grandfather's blood and sweat to a spreadsheet. Croft stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head, retreating to his luxury SUV. Pride is a terrible fertilizer, Arthur. It doesn't grow a damn thing. As the Range Rover sped away, leaving a trail of suffocating dust in its wake, Claire stepped out onto the porch, wrapping her arms around Arthur from behind. What are we going to do? She asked softly. Arthur looked out at the barren, cracked fields. I'm going to fertilize the North Tract tonight, he said. It's a long shot, but if I can get just one healthy yield from that acreage, it might be enough to secure a private bridge loan. Arthur, we barely have enough nitrogen mix left for 10 acres, let alone the whole tract, Claire reasoned, her voice trembling, and the tractor is practically falling apart. I have to try, Arthur said, his voice hollow but resolute. I have to try. Midnight descended on Oak Haven like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The heat had barely broken, and the air in the corrugated steel equipment barn was thick and stagnant. A single, flickering fluorescent bulb cast long, unnatural shadows against the walls as Arthur wrenched a heavy steel bolt on his aging John Deere sprayer. His knuckles were bleeding. He was running on 3 hours of sleep, strong black coffee, and the sheer, desperate adrenaline of a man backed into a corner. In the corner of the barn sat his remaining supply of fertilizer. It was a cheap, generic ammonium nitrate blend, barely enough to cover a fraction of his fields. But it was all he had left. Arthur wiped his bloody knuckles on a rag and walked over to the mixing tank. The fatigue was pulling at the edges of his vision, making the corners of the barn blur and swim. He hauled the heavy bags of fertilizer to the lip of the tank, ripping them open and pouring the white granules into the hopper. He needed to dilute it with water, but as he reached for the heavy industrial hose, his boot caught on an uneven patch of concrete. Arthur stumbled forward, throwing his hands out to brace his fall. He crashed violently into a towering stack of rusted, unmarked steel drums in the darkest corner of the shed. These barrels had belonged to his late father, Thomas Pendleton. Thomas had been considered eccentric by the local farming community. While others embraced heavy synthetic chemicals in the late 90s, Thomas had become obsessed with alternative soil biology. He spent his final years brewing strange, foul-smelling concoctions of fermented kelp, raw molasses, liquid zinc, and strange bacterial cultures, convinced he could create a bioactive serum to make crops drought-resistant. The town called him a madman. When Thomas passed away, Arthur had simply shoved his father's failed experiments into the corner and forgotten them. The impact of Arthur's fall sent the stack toppling. With a deafening metallic screech, 3 of the rusted drums ruptured. Thick, viscous liquid spilled out across the concrete floor. One was a dark, almost black sludge that smelled intensely of the ocean, likely his father's fermented kelp and fish emulsion, aged for over a decade in an anaerobic environment. Another drum bled a striking rust-colored liquid rich in oxidized iron and liquid zinc. The third was a bubbling, murky amber fluid that smelled sharply of vinegar and yeast, some sort of dormant microbial inoculant. No, no, no! Arthur scrambled backward, watching in horror as the three mysterious fluids, Taitu, pooled together on the slanted concrete floor and began flowing rapidly toward the open floor drain, which fed directly into his massive underground mixing cistern, the cistern that was currently holding his last batch of ammonium nitrate. Arthur lunged for the emergency shut-off valve, slipping wildly in the slick, foul-smelling sludge. He wrenched the valve shut, but it was too late. The entirety of his father's bizarre, decade-old biological bruise had drained into the main tank, violently mixing with the chemical nitrogen. He scrambled down the ladder into the pump room and looked at the flow meter. The chemicals had completely combined. Arthur leaned against the cold concrete wall, sliding down until he was sitting in the dirt. He put his head in his hands and let out a broken, hollow laugh. It was over. He had just contaminated his last batch of fertilizer with whatever rotting, acidic sludge his crazy father had brewed 10 years ago. If he sprayed this on his crops, the extreme acidity and unknown bacterial load would likely burn the roots to ash. He sat there for 20 minutes, listening to the ominous bubbling sound coming from the mixing tank. The chemical reaction between the synthetic nitrogen and the ancient, fermented organic matter was generating heat. It smelled like ammonia, wet earth, and something sharply sweet. Eating suddenly, a low rumble echoed through the metal roof of the barn. Arthur looked up. The rumble came again, louder this time. Thunder. He stood up, rushing out of the barn doors. The night sky to the west, usually a clear, starry expanse, was an inky, churning black. The wind had shifted, bringing with it the distinct metallic scent of ozone. A freak summer squall was rolling in, fast and hard. If he sprayed now, the rain would wash the mixture deep into the soil. Arthur looked back at the mixing tank. It was a choice between doing nothing and letting the bank take the farm on Monday, or spraying a ruined accidental concoction of rotting kelp, zinc, and nitrogen into the dirt just to say he went down swinging. Pride is a terrible fertilizer, Croft's voice echoed in his mind. To hell with you, Harrison, Arthur growled. He ran back into the barn, fired up the old John Deere, and engaged the pump. The engine roared to life, coughing black smoke into the rafters. Arthur hooked the tank to the tractor's spraying rig, climbed into the cab, and drove out into the oppressive night. As the first fat, heavy drops of rain began to hit the windshield, Arthur engaged the boom sprayers. The liquid that shot out of the nozzles wasn't the usual pale, translucent chemical spray. It was a thick, frothy, iridescent brown-green mist. As it hit the parched, cracked earth, it hissed, almost as if the soil was reacting to it. Arthur drove blindly through the storm, guided only by the headlights cutting through the driving rain. He sprayed the entire north tract, emptying the tank completely. The storm raged around him, a torrential downpour that pounded the weird concoction deep into the fissures of the earth. When the tank was finally dry, Arthur parked the tractor, stumbled into the house, stripping off his soaked, foul-smelling clothes, and collapsed into bed next to Claire. He was entirely defeated. He had sprayed poison on dead crops. He closed his eyes, waiting for the inevitable end. For 7 days after the storm, Arthur didn't go down to the North Tract. There was no point. The rain had been a brief, isolated anomaly, and the brutal, punishing heat had immediately returned, baking the earth into a hardened crust once again. He spent the week on the phone, desperately calling independent lenders in 3 different states, enduring rejection after polite rejection. On the morning of the 8th day, a frantic banging on the front door jarred Arthur from a restless sleep. He trudged downstairs, bleary-eyed, to find Old Man Henderson, a neighboring cattle rancher, standing on the porch. Henderson looked breathless, his weathered face pale beneath his trucker hat. "Arthur," Henderson gasped, pointing a trembling finger toward the horizon. "You need to come out here, right now." "What is it, Jim? Did some of your heifers break through the fence again?" Arthur asked, rubbing his temples. "No, Arthur, you just need to look at your north tract. I was driving down County Road 9 and I nearly put my truck in the ditch." Frowning, Arthur grabbed his boots and stepped off the porch. He climbed into Henderson's battered pickup, and they drove the half-mile down the dusty dirt road toward the lower 40 acres. As they crested the small ridge overlooking the fields, Arthur stopped breathing. He stepped out of the truck, his mind unable to process the visual information his eyes were receiving. The surrounding landscape, Henderson's pastures, the distant hills, the unplanted fields, was a uniform, depressing shade of straw yellow and ash gray. But Arthur's north tract was a violent, explosive ocean of green. It wasn't just green, it was a deep, vibrant, almost radioactive emerald hue that spoke of profound, unstoppable biological vitality. And the stalks, they weren't the stunted, knee-high failures they had been a week ago. Arthur broke into a run, stumbling down the ridge and plunging into the field. The corn stalks towered over him, easily reaching 8 feet high. The stalks were as thick as his wrists, fibrous and incredibly strong. The leaves were massive, broad, and slick with moisture, despite the fact that there had been no rain for a week. As Arthur pushed through the dense canopy, he realized it was completely shaded, creating a cool, humid microclimate beneath the leaves. He grabbed an ear of corn, stripping back the green husk. The kernels were perfectly formed, large and bursting with a pale, milky starch. It was a miracle. It was utterly, scientifically impossible. "What in God's name did you do, Arthur?" Henderson whispered, having followed him into the dense thicket. "I've been farming this county for 50 years. Corn doesn't grow 4 feet in a week. It don't look like this without a $1 million irrigation setup." Arthur dropped to his knees, ignoring the dirt staining his jeans. He began digging frantically at the base of one of the massive stalks. The soil, which had been like concrete 8 days ago, was now loose, crumbly, and dark brown. It smelled richly of forest floor, rain, and life. As he dug deeper, exposing the root system, he gasped. Standard corn roots spread out shallowly, but these roots were thick, white, and covered in a dense, web-like fuzz. A massive, hyper-aggressive fungal mycelium network, and the taproots weren't spreading outward. They were driving straight down, plunging feet into the earth, breaking through the hardened clay pan and tapping deep into the ancient subsoil moisture reserves that standard crops could never reach. His father's fermented kelp, the liquid zinc, the dormant microbes, combined with the shock of the synthetic nitrogen. It hadn't burned the plants. It had acted as an enzymatic skeleton key, unlocking a hyper-symbiotic relationship between the roots and the dead soil. Arthur was staring at the impossible when the sound of an approaching engine broke his concentration. He stood up, walking out to the edge of the county road just as Harrison Croft's midnight blue Range Rover slammed on its brakes, skidding to a halt in the gravel. Dr. Whitmore was the first one out of the vehicle. The agronomist looked completely unhinged. His usually perfectly combed hair was wild in the morning wind, and his eyes behind his silver-rimmed glasses were wide with shock. He ran up to the fence line, stopping just short of the towering green wall of crops. "This is a trick," Whitmore stammered, pulling his tablet out with shaking hands. "This is a visual anomaly. What did you spray on this? Green dye? Paint?" Harrison Croft stepped out, slamming the car door. His face was a mask of cold fury, masking a deep, underlying panic. "Pendleton, what the hell is this?" Arthur walked slowly up to the fence, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his weathered face. For the first time in 3 years, the crushing weight on his chest was gone. "I believe," Arthur said, crossing his arms. "This is what you call a failed organic experiment, Harrison." Whitmore ignored the banter. He fell to his knees by the fence line, using a stainless steel soil probe to punch into the earth. He pulled up a core sample and stared at it, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The microbial count. Whitmore whispered, his voice trembling as he looked at the readouts on his portable scanner. It's off the charts. The nitrogen-fixing bacteria are reproducing at a geometric rate. The fungal networks are converting atmospheric nitrogen directly into the root systems. Mr. Croft, this soil isn't just fertile, it's hyperactive. It's doing in 1 week what our best synthetic labs couldn't do in 10 years. Croft's eyes darted from the towering corn to Arthur, his mind calculating furiously. Who gave this to you? Croft demanded, his voice dropping to a low, threatening register. Which competitor did you partner with? Was it BioAgra? Did they use you as a black site testing ground for an unapproved biological? Nobody used me, Harrison, Arthur said softly, leaning over the wooden fence post. I mixed a batch of my father's old compost with some cheap urea, and I sprayed it in the dark. Turns out, the old man wasn't a crackpot after all. He was just 20 years ahead of you. Croft's hands balled into fists. You listen to me, you ignorant dirt scratcher. You have a fluke, an anomaly. By next week, these plants will burn themselves out and die from the metabolic stress. Maybe, Arthur said, turning his back on the CICO and walking back into the cool, towering shadows of his miracle crop. But until then, the price of my land just went up. As Arthur disappeared into the green expanse, Dr. Whitmore looked up at Croft, his face pale. Mr. Croft, the scientist whispered, clutching the vial of dirt. If this isn't a fluke, if he's actually stabilized a rapid-growth biological catalyst. I know what it means, Elias, Croft hissed, staring at the farm with a newfound ravenous hunger. It means we don't just need his land anymore. We need whatever the hell is in that soil, and we are going to take it by any means necessary. The euphoria of the miraculous harvest was a fragile, fleeting thing, quickly eclipsed by the cold, hard mathematics of Arthur Pendleton's reality. He had 22 days until Midland National Bank executed the foreclosure. A sprawling alien forest of 12-foot-tall corn might be an agricultural marvel. But until it was harvested, graded, and sold on the commodities market, it was just exceptionally beautiful foliage. And the market wouldn't touch a crop that hadn't been certified, especially not one that defied every known law of botanical physics. Arthur knew he needed a scientific ally. Someone entirely disconnected from Harrison Croft's sprawling corporate influence. Early the next morning, he packed 3 massive ears of corn and a sealed mason jar of the dark, hyperactive soil into the cab of his rusted pickup truck. He drove 3 hours east to the University of Nebraska's Agricultural Extension in Lincoln, specifically seeking out Dr. Benjamin Wallace. Wallace was an old-school botanist, a man who had famously clashed with Croft AgriCorp years prior over their aggressive patenting of synthetic seeds. If anyone would give Arthur a straight answer without calling Croft, it was Wallace. The university laboratory smelled sterile, a stark contrast to the rich, earthy scent of Arthur's fields. Dr. Wallace, a gaunt man with a neatly trimmed gray beard and a faded flannel shirt beneath his lab coat, adjusted his thick spectacles as he peered into the electron microscope. He had been silent for 45 minutes. Arthur paced the length of the linoleum floor, the anxiety gnawing at his stomach. Well, Ben, are you going to tell me I created a monster, or are you going to tell me it's a fluke? Dr. Wallace slowly leaned back from the eyepiece, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. He looked at Arthur as if seeing a ghost. Arthur, what your father brewed in those barrels wasn't just compost. It was an anaerobic biological catalyst. When you introduced the high-nitrogen urea, you didn't burn it. You ignited a dormant metabolic engine. Wallace walked over to a whiteboard, quickly sketching out a series of root structures. Standard synthetic fertilizers force-feed the plant, making it lazy. The roots stay shallow. But this concoction of yours contains a hyper-aggressive strain of mycorrhizal fungi, completely mutated by a decade of anaerobic fermentation with liquid zinc and kelp. When the nitrogen hit it, the fungi went into a frenzied state of reproduction. It bonded with the corn's root system overnight. The fungi are breaking down the hardened, dead clay of your subsoil, extracting locked-away moisture and microscopic minerals, and mainlining them directly into the stalks. It's not just growing, Arthur. It's terraforming the dirt as it spreads. Is it safe? Arthur asked, his voice tight. Croft's agronomist acted like I'd just sprayed radioactive waste on the county. Safe? Arthur, this is the cleanest, most robust biological profile I have ever seen, Wallace said, picking up one of the massive ears of corn. The starch content is 30% higher than commercial averages. The nutrient density is off the charts. If you can replicate this, you haven't just saved your farm. You've rendered Croft's entire multi-billion-dollar synthetic chemical division completely obsolete. That sentence hung in the quiet laboratory like a dropped anvil. Arthur felt a sudden icy chill crawl up his spine. Harrison Croft was a man who fiercely protected his monopolies. If Croft AgriCorp's chemical division was threatened, Croft wouldn't just try to buy the farm anymore, he would raze it to the ground. Arthur sped back to Oak Haven, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He arrived at the farm just after dusk. The property was quiet, the only sound the rhythmic chirping of cicadas and the low rustle of the massive corn stalks swaying in the evening breeze. He parked the truck and immediately walked toward the equipment barn, intending to secure the remaining rusted drums of his father's mixture. As he approached the corrugated steel structure, he noticed the heavy iron padlock on the main doors had been sheared clean off, lying in the dirt like a discarded toy. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. He silently crept to the side entrance, peering through a cracked, grimy window. Inside, the beams of 3 high-powered tactical flashlights sliced through the darkness. 3 men, dressed in unmarked black tactical gear, were moving methodically through the barn. One was using a portable battery-powered angle grinder to cut the bolts off the main mixing cistern, while the other 2 were carefully siphoning the remaining sludge from his father's rusted drums into heavy-duty, hazardous materials transport jugs. They weren't just stealing the formula, they were destroying the equipment to ensure Arthur could never spray another acre. Anger, hot and blinding, surged through Arthur's veins. This was his grandfather's land. This was his father's life's work. He sprinted quietly to the farmhouse, bursting through the kitchen door. Claire jumped up from the table, startled. "Call Sheriff Davies," Arthur whispered fiercely, grabbing a flashlight and the heavy 12-gauge pump-action shotgun mounted above the fireplace. "Tell him we have heavily armed trespassers in the barn." "Arthur, no! Wait for the deputies," Claire pleaded, grabbing his arm. "By the time Davies gets here from town, they'll be gone, and they'll have the only thing keeping us out of bankruptcy," Arthur replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He pumped a shell into the chamber, the mechanical clack-clack echoing sharply in the living room. "Stay inside, lock the doors. Lock." Arthur slipped out into the darkness, using the towering wall of his mutated cornfield as cover to flank the barn. He crept up to the wide-open main doors, just as the leader of the intruders hoisted a heavy, sloshing jug of the proprietary biological sludge onto his shoulder. Arthur stepped into the doorway, snapping on his heavy maglite and blinding the 3 men. He leveled the barrel of the shotgun directly at the leader's chest. "Drop the jug, or the next thing you'll be harvesting is buckshot," Arthur roared, his voice echoing like thunder inside the metal walls. The intruders froze. For an agonizing second, nobody moved. The leader, his face obscured by a black balaclava, slowly lowered the heavy plastic jug to the concrete floor. "You're making a mistake, Pendleton," the leader sneered, his voice muffled. "You have no idea what you're playing with. You can't protect this. It's too big for a dirt farmer to hold onto." "I said step back," Arthur yelled, raising the barrel a fraction of an inch. Suddenly, the man by the cistern kicked over a heavy stack of steel pipes. The deafening clatter startled Arthur, causing him to instinctively flinch. In that split second, the leader drew a heavy, serialized tactical baton from his belt and hurled it wildly. It struck Arthur's shoulder, sending a shock wave of pain down his arm. The flashlight dropped, shattering on the concrete and plunging the barn into absolute darkness, save for the narrow beams of the intruder's lights sweeping wildly across the walls. "Go, move," the leader barked. The 3 men scrambled out the back utility door, abandoning the heavy jugs of sludge but carrying 2 small, vital vials of the concentrated soil and root samples they had already extracted. Arthur blindly fired a warning shot into the dirt floor, the muzzle flash brilliantly illuminating the empty barn for a fraction of a second. But it was too late. He heard the heavy, roaring engine of a high-performance diesel truck firing up on the county road behind the property, tearing away into the night before he could even reach the door. Arthur leaned against the cold metal wall of the barn, sliding down to the floor, his shoulder throbbing violently. They had stolen the biological samples. Croft had the keys to the kingdom. The morning after the break-in, Arthur stood over the abandoned plastic jugs in the barn, a bitter taste in his mouth. Sheriff Davies had come and gone, taking a report that both men knew would lead nowhere. The truck had no plates, the men wore masks, and Croft Agricorp had an army of lawyers capable of burying a small-town police department in a blizzard of paperwork. Croft had the soil biology, and with his massive research and development labs, it was only a matter of time before Dr. Whitmore reverse-engineered the fungal strains. But Arthur still had the crops. The corn on the North Tract had now reached an astonishing 14 feet. The stalks were practically trunks, and the ears were the size of a man's forearm, bursting with sweet, nutrient-dense kernels. If he could harvest and sell it, he could pay off the bank. However, Harrison Croft was not a man who played a single hand at a time. If he couldn't have the monopoly, he would ensure Arthur couldn't profit from the prototype. At noon, Claire walked out into the field, her face pale, holding a portable radio. "Arthur, you need to hear this," she said, her voice trembling. She turned up the volume. It was the local Oak Haven agricultural radio broadcast, syndicated across the entire state. But it wasn't the usual crop reports. The polished, arrogant voice of Dr. Elias Whitmore filled the humid air. "Then it is a matter of severe public safety." Whitmore's voice crackled over the speaker. "Our preliminary atmospheric and perimeter scans of the Pendleton property indicate the presence of heavily mutated, unapproved, genetically modified organisms. This is an unregulated biological hazard. The extreme growth rate suggests the presence of volatile carcinogenic compounds. We are urging the State Agricultural Board to immediately quarantine the farm. Any crops harvested from that soil are highly toxic and unfit for human or livestock consumption." Arthur stared at the radio, his blood turning to ice. It was a masterstroke of corporate assassination. Croft didn't need to destroy the crops. He just needed to destroy their reputation. In the highly regulated world of farming, the mere accusation of toxic, unapproved mutations was a death sentence. No commercial buyer, silo, or commodities broker would touch Arthur's harvest. 10 minutes later, the crushing blow landed. The gravel driveway crunched as a sleek, black sedan pulled up to the farmhouse. David Henley, the branch manager of Midland National Bank, stepped out. He looked profoundly uncomfortable, clutching a thick manila folder to his chest like a shield. Arthur marched out to meet him, not bothering to hide his fury. "Tell me Croft didn't send you, David. Tell me you aren't doing the dirty work for that snake." Henley swallowed hard, refusing to meet Arthur's eyes. "Arthur, my hands are tied." The bank's risk assessment team heard the broadcast. Croft Agricorp formally filed an environmental hazard complaint with the county because the property is collateral on your delinquent loan. The bank is legally exposed to the liability of a toxic cleanup. We are executing an emergency acceleration clause. The 30-day grace period is voided. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises before the state marshals seize the deed. "It's a lie," Claire shouted from the porch, tears of frustration streaming down her face. "The corn is perfectly safe. Ben Wallace at the university proved it." "I'm sorry, Claire," Henley said, quickly retreating to his car. "Wallace isn't an FDA regulator. The bank isn't taking the risk. 2 days, Arthur. I am truly sorry." As Henley sped away, Arthur looked at the massive, towering wall of green defiance. He had the greatest harvest in the history of Oak Haven County, and it was going to be bulldozed and burned by a corporate lie. "What do we do?" Claire asked, stepping down into the dirt and taking Arthur's hand. "Do we call a lawyer?" "Lawyers take months. We have 48 hours. Arthur said, his mind racing. He looked down at the massive ear of corn he had pulled that morning. He thought about Dr. Wallace's words. The nutrient density is off the charts. Croft wants to use the media to paint us as a toxic hazard, Arthur said, a reckless, desperate plan forming in his mind. We are going to use the media to prove he's a liar, but we aren't going to tell them. We are going to show them. Arthur ran into the house, grabbing the telephone. He dialed the number for Sarah Jenkins, an investigative journalist for the regional Omaha News Network, who had previously run a scathing, underreported series on Croft AgriCorp's monopolistic land grabs. "Sarah, it's Arthur Pendleton," he said when she answered. "You want the follow-up of a lifetime to your Croft expose? Bring a camera crew to my farm tomorrow morning at 9, and bring the state agricultural commissioner. Tell him if he doesn't show, he's going to miss the biggest agricultural scandal of the decade." By 8:30 a.m. the next morning, the dirt road leading to the Pendleton farm was choked with vehicles. Sarah Jenkins' news van was parked precariously on the shoulder, a cameraman rushing to set up a live feed. Rumors of the 14-foot mutant corn and Croft's toxic hazard warnings had spread like wildfire across social media, drawing a crowd of skeptical neighboring farmers, aggressive local reporters, and, surprisingly, a state agricultural inspector looking incredibly annoyed. At exactly 9 a.m., Harrison Croft's midnight blue Range Rover arrived, flanked by 2 private security vehicles. Croft and Dr. Whitmore stepped out, looking intensely smug. They had come to watch the execution of Arthur's legacy. Arthur walked out of the barn, flanked by Claire and Dr. Benjamin Wallace, who had driven through the night from Lincoln to be there. "Mr. Pendleton," Sarah Jenkins called out, shoving a microphone toward his face while the camera red light blinked on, broadcasting live across the region. "Croft AgriCorp alleges you are growing an unregulated, highly toxic biohazard that threatens the county water table. The bank is seizing your land tomorrow. What is your response?" The crowd went silent. Croft stood at the edge of the property line, a razor-thin smile playing on his lips. "It's over, Arthur," Croft called out loudly. "Don't embarrass yourself on television. Step down." Arthur ignored him. He walked directly up to the camera, his rugged face hard and unyielding. "Harrison Croft says this soil is poisoned," Arthur said, his voice booming across the quiet farm. "He says this crop is toxic. He says this because my father's organic formula naturally achieved what his billion-dollar synthetic labs couldn't do in a century. He is lying to protect his monopoly." Arthur turned, walking to the edge of the towering, deeply green cornfield. He reached up, grasping a massive ear of corn, and with a sharp twist, snapped it off the stalk. He peeled back the thick, green husk, revealing the pristine, milky white and gold kernels beneath. "Dr. Whitmore claims this will kill livestock and humans alike," Arthur said, turning back to the camera and the stunned crowd. Without breaking eye contact with Harrison Croft, Arthur raised the raw ear of corn to his mouth. "Arthur, no!" Whitmore yelled, genuinely startled. Arthur took a massive, crunching bite of the raw corn. The sweet, starch-rich juice ran down his chin. He chewed methodically, swallowing the raw kernels. He then snapped the ear in half and handed a piece to Dr. Wallace, who smiled, took a bite, and gave the camera a thumbs up. Arthur wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, staring directly at the local agricultural inspector, and then at Croft. "Tastes like survival, Harrison," Arthur said, his voice ringing with absolute defiance. "Now I believe the inspector here needs to take a certified sample to verify Dr. Wallace's lab results. Because when this comes back completely clean, I'm not just selling this harvest. I'm suing Croft AgriCorp for corporate defamation, industrial espionage, and market manipulation." The camera panned to Harrison Croft. For the first time in his perfectly curated corporate life, the CEO looked absolutely, utterly terrified. The viral harvest had begun. The crunch of Arthur Pendleton chewing raw corn on live television echoed across the state of Nebraska, reverberating through the heavily subsidized halls of corporate agriculture like a gunshot. The silence that followed in the farmyard was absolute, broken only by the mechanical whirring of Sarah Jenkins's camera lens, focusing tightly on Harrison Croft's rapidly paling face. Inspector Gregory Folsom, a usually lethargic state bureaucrat whose career consisted of rubber-stamping silo inspections, found himself thrust into the center of a media circus, visibly sweating under the morning sun and the intense glare of the camera lights. Folsom stepped forward. He produced a sterile chain of custody evidence bag, his hands trembling slightly as he accepted the remaining half of the massive golden ear of corn from Dr. Benjamin Wallace. The state laboratory in Lincoln will have the toxicology and pathology reports expedited, Folsom stammered, sealing the bag with a tamper-evident zip tie. Given the public interest, we will run a full mass spectrometry panel. If there are heavy metals, unapproved synthetic modifications, or carcinogenic pathogens, we will find them. Until then, the quarantine stands, but the demolition order is paused. Arthur stared hard at David Henley, the bank manager, who was actively trying to shrink into the upholstery of his sedan. "You heard the inspector, David," Arthur called out, his voice projecting over the murmuring crowd of neighboring farmers. "The demolition is paused. If Midland National Bank sends so much as a riding mower onto my property before those lab results return, Sarah here will have a front row seat to the largest trespassing lawsuit in county history." Henley didn't say a word. He threw the sedan into reverse and sped away, kicking up a rooster tail of dry dirt. Harrison Croft realized the optics of the situation were spiraling out of his control. He turned sharply on his heel, his tailored suit completely out of place in the dusty yard, and marched toward his midnight blue Range Rover. Dr. Elias Whitmore hurried after him like a scolded dog. As they drove off, the gathered crowd of local farmers, men and women who had spent years being financially squeezed by Croft AgriCorp, erupted into cheers, slapping Arthur on the back. But Arthur knew the war was far from over. A corporate predator like Croft didn't retreat. He simply rearmed 60 miles away, inside the sterile, hermetically sealed underground research facility of Croft AgriCorp headquarters. Dr. Whitmore was experiencing a catastrophic scientific failure. The stolen vials of sludge and soil from Arthur's barn sat in the center of a stainless steel examination table, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. Whitmore stared at the readouts on the gas chromatograph, pulling his silver-rimmed glasses off and rubbing his bloodshot eyes. "It's dead," he whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief. "It's completely, utterly dead." Croft stood in the doorway of the lab, his face a mask of cold, unyielding rage. "Explain it to me, Elias. I pay you 7 figures a year to understand dirt. You told me the microbes in that stolen sludge were reproducing at a geometric rate. You told me we had the key to a billion-dollar biological catalyst." "We did," Whitmore insisted, frantically tapping the screen of his terminal. "When I sampled the soil at the fence line, the mycorrhizal fungal network was hyperactive. But the pure sludge your mercenaries extracted from those rusted barrels, it's inert in the lab. The anaerobic bacteria died the moment they were exposed to excessive oxygen during the sloppy transfer. But worse, the surviving fungal spores refused to bond with our proprietary synthetic soils." Croft stepped closer, his shadow falling over the lab bench. "Why?" "Because our soils are sterile, Mr. Croft," Whitmore admitted, swallowing hard. "We've spent 20 years engineering our fields to be blank slates, killing all native bacteria, so our chemical fertilizers are the only nutrient source. Pendleton sludge isn't a standalone fertilizer, it's an ignition key. It requires a specific legacy soil biome, decades of old-school organic matter, specific trace minerals, and dormant native fungi to activate. We can't replicate it without Pendleton's exact land. Without his specific dirt, the formula is useless to us." A heavy, suffocating silence filled the laboratory. Croft looked at the useless stolen sludge, realizing he had underestimated the sheer, complex genius of Thomas Pendleton's eccentric, decades-old organic farming methods. He couldn't steal the product because the product was the farm. "If we cannot monetize it, Elias," Croft said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper, "then we must ensure it never reaches the open market. If that crop is certified safe, every independent farmer in the Midwest will realize they don't need our chemicals. It will collapse our entire synthetic division." Croft pulled a sleek, encrypted smartphone from his vest pocket. He dialed his lead corporate litigator. "I need an emergency intellectual property injunction, filed in federal court immediately." Pendleton admitted on live television that he mixed his father's compost with cheap synthetic urea. "Find out who manufactured that urea." There was a brief pause as Croft listened to the lawyer on the other end. A sinister smile slowly spread across his face. "Excellent. It was a subsidiary of ours. Draft the injunction. Pendleton violated the end-user chemical licensing agreement by utilizing our proprietary urea as a mixing agent for an unlicensed biological experiment. Claim that the resulting biomass is a derivative product of Croft AgriCorp intellectual property. Lock his fields down in federal litigation." By sunset, a black town car arrived at the Pendleton farm. A process server stepped out, handing a thick, imposing stack of legal documents to Claire. Arthur read through the legalese at the kitchen table, his heart sinking like a stone. "They aren't trying to say it's toxic anymore," Arthur said, his voice hollow. "They're claiming they own it. The urea I bought from the supply store was manufactured by a Croft subsidiary. The fine print says it can't be used in unapproved biological engineering. Because I mixed it with the sludge, they are claiming corporate ownership of the entire mutated crop." "Can they do that?" Claire asked, tears welling in her eyes. "It's our land, Arthur. It's your father's formula." "They have unlimited funds, Claire," Arthur sighed, throwing the papers onto the table. "They can keep this in federal court for 5 years. By the time a judge rules, the corn will have rotted in the fields, the bank will have foreclosed, and Croft will buy the land at auction anyway. He's boxed us in." Despair hung heavy over the Pendleton farmhouse. The 14-foot-tall corn outside stood as a magnificent, mocking monument to a victory that was being stolen out from under them. Dr. Benjamin Wallace, who had stayed the night on the living room sofa, was hunched over his laptop at the kitchen table, furiously reviewing the preliminary mass spectrometry data that a colleague at the state lab had secretly emailed him. Suddenly, Wallace slammed his hand on the table, jolting Arthur awake from a light doze in the armchair. "Arthur, you need to look at this," Wallace exclaimed, turning the laptop screen toward him. "The state lab results are in. Not only is the crop entirely non-toxic, but I've finally isolated the specific catalyst in your father's formula. It wasn't just the fermented kelp or the dormant fungi." Arthur rubbed his eyes, leaning over the screen. "What am I looking at, Ben?" "Iron oxide chelation," Wallace said, pointing to a spike on the chemical graph. "Your father stored this mixture in unlined, heavy-gauge steel drums from the 1970s for a decade. The immense rust that developed inside those barrels slowly bled into the highly acidic anaerobic sludge. The microbes consumed the oxidized iron, mutating into a hyper-efficient delivery system. That's why Croft's stolen samples are useless to him. He doesn't have the iron-chelated microbes, and he doesn't have your native soil. He has zero scientific claim to this reaction. The urea was completely incinerated in the metabolic process. There isn't a single trace of Croft's synthetic nitrogen left in the plant tissue. His intellectual property lawsuit is scientifically baseless." Arthur's eyes widened. "If the state lab certifies that no Croft chemicals remain in the plant, the federal judge will throw out the injunction." "Exactly," Wallace grinned. "The official certification is scheduled to be digitally published to the state registry at 8 a.m. tomorrow. The moment that happens, you are legally clear to harvest, and Croft's lawsuit turns into dust." Across the county, Harrison Croft sat in his cavernous glass-walled office, staring out into the pitch-black night. He had just received the same leaked preliminary lab data from a paid informant inside the state agricultural department. His legal strategy was dead on arrival. Tomorrow morning, Arthur Pendleton would become a millionaire, and Croft AgriCorp would face an existential public relations and financial crisis. Croft picked up his phone, bypassing his lawyers and calling a completely off-the-books number. "The legal route is compromised," Croft said coldly to the man on the other end, a private contractor known for handling extreme corporate liabilities. "Pendleton's crop will be certified at 8 in the morning. I need that entire north tract neutralized before the sun comes up." "I don't care how you do it. "Understood, Mr. Croft," the raspy voice replied. "We have a crop duster stationed at the old county airstrip. We will load it with an unlisted military-grade defoliant. By dawn, his miracle crop will be nothing but withered ash. It will look like a delayed metabolic collapse of his own doing." At 4:30 a.m., the air over Oakhaven County was perfectly still, clinging to the cool darkness just before the dawn. Arthur was awake, sitting on the porch with a mug of black coffee, watching the towering silhouette of his fields. He felt a strange sense of peace. In 3 hours, the certification would go live. Then he heard it, a low mechanical drone vibrating through the crisp morning air. It wasn't the rumble of a tractor. It was the high-pitched, steady whine of an aviation engine, flying dangerously low. Arthur stood up, his coffee mug shattering on the porch boards. He looked to the eastern horizon. Against the faint, gray pre-dawn light, he saw the unmistakable silhouette of an old biplane, its wing-mounted spray booms clearly visible. It was flying directly toward the North Tract. "Claire!" Arthur roared, bursting into the house. "Call Jim Henderson. Tell him to bring every piece of heavy machinery he has to the North Tract right now. Call the sheriff." Arthur didn't wait. He sprinted to the barn, threw open the doors, and climbed into the cab of his massive combine harvester. He fired up the heavy diesel engine, the machine roaring to life like an angry beast. He slammed it into gear and drove out of the barn, hurtling toward the edge of the cornfield. The crop duster was making its initial banking turn, lining up for a direct spray run over the heart of the 14-foot-tall crop. If that defoliant hit the leaves, the entire harvest would melt into toxic sludge within hours. Arthur reached the edge of the field just as Jim Henderson's massive cattle truck came tearing down the dirt road, followed closely by 2 other neighboring farmers in heavy-duty tractors. Henderson had been listening to the police scanner and knew exactly what was at stake. "Jim, turn on everything," Arthur screamed over the roar of the engines, grabbing his CB radio. "Blind him." As the crop duster descended, preparing to open its chemical valves, Arthur engaged the massive stadium-grade LED floodlights mounted on the roof of his combine. Henderson and the other farmers did the same. A blinding, synchronized wall of brilliant white light erupted from the ground, cutting fiercely into the dim morning sky. The pilot of the crop duster, wearing night vision goggles to navigate the low-altitude pre-dawn run, was instantly blinded by the overwhelming photonic blast. The intense light overloaded his optics. Panicking and utterly disoriented, the pilot violently yanked the flight stick backward. The biplane pitched sharply upward, the engine screaming as it fought for altitude. The spray booms clipped the very tops of the massive corn stalks, tearing off a few leaves, but the chemical valves remained shut. The plane pulled up into the sky, abandoning the run, and banked hard to the south, fleeing the county before the sheriff could arrive. Arthur leaned back in the cab of the combine, his chest heaving, his hands shaking violently on the steering wheel. The blinding floodlights illuminated the towering, magnificent wall of green that had survived the final, desperate assassination attempt. At exactly 8 a.m., Arthur's cell phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Dr. Benjamin Wallace. It contained a single screenshot. The official Nebraska State Agricultural Registry. The Pendleton crop was officially certified as safe, non-toxic, and entirely free of synthetic chemical patents. Arthur stepped out of the combine, the morning sun finally cresting over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the greatest harvest Oakhaven County had ever seen. The siege was over. It was time to reap what he had sown. The sun climbed higher into the cloudless Nebraska sky, casting long, dramatic shadows across the North Tract. The certification was no longer a secret. It was the lead story on every agricultural news network across the American Midwest. Arthur Pendleton had achieved the impossible. He successfully stabilized a hyper-symbiotic organic supercrop, and now the entire world was watching him harvest it. But cutting down 14-foot corn was a monumental logistical nightmare. Arthur's aging combine harvester, built for standard 8-foot stalks, immediately choked on the sheer density of the mutated biomass. The massive, fibrous trunks jammed the header, and within 20 minutes the primary drive belt snapped with a loud crack. Arthur climbed down from the cab, wiping grease from his forehead, looking at the impenetrable wall of green. He had 40 acres of record-breaking corn, and his machinery was entirely inadequate for the task. As he stood there contemplating his move, a deep rumble echoed down the county road. Arthur turned to see a breathtaking sight. A convoy of massive, heavy-duty harvesting equipment was rolling toward his farm. Leading the procession was Jim Henderson in his heavy cattle truck, but behind him were 5 brand-new, high-capacity rotary combines. They belonged to the independent farmers of Oak Haven County. These were men and women who had spent years being slowly suffocated by Croft AgriCorp's predatory pricing and heavy-handed chemical monopolies. Now, they were here to help Arthur secure the harvest that would break the corporate stranglehold forever. The local community descended upon the North Tract with relentless energy. Sarah Jenkins and her news crew filmed from the perimeter as the massive machines chewed through the towering corn stalks. The yield was staggering. Standard commercial corn typically produced about 170 bushels per acre. As the harvest progressed, Dr. Benjamin Wallace stood by the grain carts, frantically recalculating his figures. Arthur's crop was producing an astonishing 420 bushels per acre. The ears were so large and the kernel density so high that the grain carts were overflowing in half the normal time. The local silos, usually cautious about accepting uncontracted grain, started a massive bidding war. Independent brokers from Chicago and Kansas City began calling Arthur's phone incessantly, offering triple the standard commodity price just to secure the nutrient-dense supercrop. The market realized what Harrison Croft had feared. This corn was vastly superior to anything produced by synthetic chemical farming. It was packed with unprecedented protein levels, required 0 pesticides, and possessed a shelf life that defied standard agricultural expectations. By sunset on the 3rd day, the final stalk was cut down. The North Tract was a vast expanse of rich, dark, heavily aerated soil. The mycorrhizal fungi had done its job perfectly, breaking down the dead clay pan and leaving behind a nutrient-rich foundation that would remain fertile for years without a single drop of synthetic fertilizer. Arthur stood in the center of his field, the cool evening wind brushing against his tired face. The sweet scent of harvested grain filled the air. Claire walked up beside him, wrapping her arms around his waist. They watched the final truck rumble down the driveway, carrying the last load of the golden harvest to the elevators. They had finally done it. Against corporate sabotage, biological tampering, and relentless pressure, the Pendleton farm had prevailed. Arthur looked at his calloused hands, realizing the weight that had finally been lifted from his shoulders. He had saved his grandfather's legacy, validated his eccentric father's organic experiments, and secured his family's future in one chaotic stroke of midnight desperation. The dark clouds of foreclosure that had hovered over them for 3 years were finally gone, replaced by the golden light of absolute victory. Yet, as the community celebrated their monumental triumph back at the farmhouse, Arthur knew there was still one piece of unfinished business to attend to. He had a bank to visit and a corporate titan to thoroughly humiliate. This fight was no longer merely about his own family's survival. It was about absolutely ensuring that no independent farmer across the entire country would ever have to face the threat of corporate extinction ever again. Monday morning arrived with a crisp, cool breeze. Arthur drove his freshly washed pickup truck into the downtown district of Oak Haven. He parked directly in front of the Midland National Bank. The lobby was quiet, the air thick with the smell of polished brass and stale coffee. David Henley was sitting at his large mahogany desk, reviewing foreclosure documents, when Arthur walked in. Arthur did not say a single word. He simply reached into his denim jacket, pulled out a certified cashier's check, and placed it gently on the desk. Henley looked down, The check was for the exact amount of the delinquent loan, plus the next 10 years of advance mortgage payments. Henley's face flushed bright red as he silently stamped the Pendleton deed paid in full. The farm was untouchable. Meanwhile, 200 miles away in Chicago, the boardroom of Croft AgriCorp was in absolute chaos. Harrison Croft stood at the head of the long glass table, sweating profusely as he faced the emergency assembly of the board of directors. The live broadcast of Arthur's harvest, combined with the state agricultural board's complete validation of the organic catalyst, had triggered a catastrophic market reaction. Independent farmers across the nation were actively canceling their synthetic fertilizer contracts. Croft AgriCorp's stock had plummeted 40% in a single week. "You assured us this dirt farmer was neutralized, Harrison," the chairman of the board said coldly, throwing a financial report onto the table. "Instead, you turned him into a martyr and broadcasted our obsolescence on live television. You deployed mercenaries, filed baseless injunctions, and ordered an illegal defoliant strike that the federal authorities are currently investigating. You are a massive liability." "I can fix this," Croft stammered, his usual arrogant composure completely shattered. "We just need to acquire his soil. I will double the buyout offer." "You don't understand, do you?" the chairman replied. "Pendleton isn't selling. In fact, he just partnered with the University of Nebraska. They are open-sourcing the biological catalyst formula." It was true. While Croft was fighting to keep his job, Arthur Pendleton and Dr. Benjamin Wallace were holding a press conference in Lincoln. Using the massive profits from the Golden Harvest, Arthur had established the Thomas Pendleton Organic Foundation. Instead of patenting the iron-chelated sludge, they published the exact recipe, microbial blueprints, and fermentation processes online for free. They launched a grant program, offering starter barrels of the catalyst to small family farms across the Midwest, teaching them how to rehabilitate their dead soil. It was the ultimate revenge. Arthur didn't just beat Croft, he fundamentally destroyed the business model that allowed corporate monopolies to exploit hardworking families. 6 months later, spring returned to Oak Haven County. The deep, agonizing drought was a distant memory. Arthur stood on the porch of his grandfather's farmhouse, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. The morning sun illuminated a sprawling, breathtaking landscape. The surrounding fields, once yellow and dead, were now rich, dark, and exploding with vibrant green life. Dozens of neighboring farms had successfully implemented the Pendleton catalyst, transforming the entire region into an agricultural paradise. Claire stepped out onto the porch, resting her head gently on his shoulder. They listened to the lively chatter of the vibrant birds and the gentle rustling of the early crops swaying in the fresh wind. The debt was completely gone. The heavy, suffocating fear that had haunted them for years had finally vanished, replaced by an unshakable sense of security and profound pride. Harrison Croft had been officially indicted for corporate sabotage, and Croft AgriCorp was rapidly liquidating its assets to avoid bankruptcy. Arthur walked down the porch steps, kneeling in the dirt of his front yard. He scooped up a handful of the soil. It was incredibly soft, dark, and teeming with boundless biological life. It no longer slipped through his fingers like dry ash. It held together, a perfect, resilient testament to endurance and faith. He smiled, letting the rich earth fall back to the ground. The legacy of the Pendleton farm was safe, rooted deeper and stronger than ever before, ensuring that future generations would always prosper upon this incredibly blessed American land. Did Arthur Pendleton's incredible fight against corporate greed inspire you? This story proves that the resilience of the independent American farmer, combined with a little bit of accidental genius, can truly bring down even the most ruthless agricultural monopolies. If you loved hearing how a desperate, midnight mistake transformed into the greatest harvest in history, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing real-life stories. Drop a comment below telling us what you would have done in Arthur's shoes. Thank you for watching and keep growing against all odds.